All right. Welcome back to the Life on Purpose podcast. I know it's been a little bit since my last episode. I took some time off actually for spending time with some family and also to be there for a friend who just lost his child. So this episode here and this topic here with Katie is going to be perfectly timed because we're talking about grief. So I am joined here today by Katie Rössler. And Katie is a transformative grief guide and licensed counselor with 13 years of experience helping individuals, couples, and families. And she is the author of her new book, The New Face of Grief, coming out on October 5th, right?
Yes.
2021. Great.
Yep.
And she's on a mission to help people learn how to heal hidden grief in their lives. So we'll talk all about that kind of, more overt grief and then these more hidden aspects of grief. So welcome, Katie, to the Life on Purpose podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And yeah, let's dive in. I mean, we can talk all things grief from death and loss to, hey, a dream that wasn't realized.
Right. And I think that's important to understand because I think we look at grief in general as what happens when you lose somebody, and in relation to kind of death, but you also talk about, some of these more hidden aspects. But I want to start from the very beginning. I would love to hear more about your story and how grief was something that you took on and started talking about and writing about. So let's start there.
Yeah, so I am a licensed counselor from the USA, but I live in Munich, Germany. So I'm an expat here. I have 3 kids, and I'm transitioning from doing couples therapy here for those who are like me, expats or bicultural couples, into focusing solely on grief work. For 13 years, I've involved grief work in everything I've done as a therapist. But I'm really seeing, especially after 2020, that it is time to really teach people about grief in a different way. So really my story begins a couple years ago with the loss of my mom at the end of October 2018. It was unexpected, and it was the catapult and catalyst to me having to do my own grief work that I thought was just about her, but ended up being a lifetime of grief experiences. In 2019, then I had 2 miscarriages, and it truly was like a back-to-back feeling of like the ocean of life kept knocking me down and kind of going, what is going on? And when I stopped and started reflecting on my grief process and when I had felt this emptiness, this kind of conversation with God and realization about life of like, what is life? What is this? Why are these things happening? I started to realize that I had experienced grief as a military kid, moving every 2 to 3 years. I had experienced grief during my parents' divorce. I experienced grief transitioning into adulthood and being on my own. And, I think we all hit that moment where you go, there's not going to ever be a summer break again. Wait, what?
Right.
I have to work through all of this. And as much as there is this like panic inside, like it feels silly to say that's grief, but there is a little bit of it, of letting go of how things were. I experienced grief when I first became a mom. And now with my third, I still have moments of letting go of the old me and really, claiming this new me, especially as the mom of 3, there's a transition there as well. So I looked at my whole life and I just said, like, this is a theme. And then I was like, okay, is it just me? Is it just grief me? So then I started thinking about my clients and I was like, wow, no, actually, grief is something we all go through. It's this experience when we have to let go of how we thought life should be, our expectations of it, into letting go of that control and realizing life is as it is. And hey, probably is occurring in such a way that's good for us,
Right.
though we don't see it in the moment.
And I think that's really, really difficult. And I wanted to kind of touch on something as I was listening to you speak. These grief experiences are kind of cumulative because a lot of the times and we're talking about these more hidden grief, these more subtle grievances through our lives, these changes of grieving maybe who we used to be or who we thought we should be, not just these kind of big losses, and they accumulate. So do those cumulative grief experiences affect how these bigger experiences affect us?
Yes, because when we have that hidden grief, which is the grief that society doesn't typically recognize
Yeah.
as grief, they build up. And then when a major loss happens, we experience a deeper low. We fall into the victim role even easier.
Yeah.
And we have higher levels of anxiety, depression, burnout, overwhelm, all of those things.
Hmm.
We may even isolate ourselves more than we would had we healed some of the past grief.
Yeah.
And this is not to say we've done anything wrong, because most of us are conditioned not to acknowledge the grief we've experienced. Go ahead.
I was thinking about a story of it was a personal story, but about how we will downplay our grief experiences. I
Yeah.
I had an experience. I've had more friends than I'd care to even explain who have had these major losses of children, and one of which happened just prior to I had a pregnancy loss that was absolutely devastating to me. And he reached out to me, this friend of mine who had just lost his infant daughter, and he
Mhm.
said he was comforting me, and I felt this extreme guilt
Yeah.
that my loss was not nearly as bad as his loss. He had a child here on this planet, and he said to me, he said, "Brandy, all it is the loss of hope for the future. You had hope for the future for this baby. I had hope for the future for my baby. It's no different." And it was very comforting, but I had this tendency to be like, well, I can't experience this grief the way he has because it's different and it's bigger somehow.
Mhm.
So I thought that that was a very poignant thing that he said, and it was something that stuck with me and that I have remembered in processing my grief, or even being there for friends who are grieving as well.
Yeah.
That are we like you said, we've been conditioned to kind of downplay these things that happen to us and just kind of bury them and be like, okay, well, it's not as bad as such and such. It's not as bad as such and such.
Right. It's grief shaming and grief, the guilt and grief, whether
Mhm.
we cause it or other people tell it, well, it's not like someone died.
Yeah.
Like it just puts it, okay, thank you. I shouldn't grieve.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I think it's beautiful he was able to say, apples, oranges, it's all
Yeah.
fruit, like you don't need to
Sure.
compare. It makes me actually think about, in business, how the feeling of imposter syndrome comes up when we compare ourselves to other people's stories. Well,
Yeah.
they were already here at this point. And anytime we compare, it can become very unhealthy because it tells us there might be something wrong with us. And in
Mhm.
reality, grief is very subjective, and it's our own personal journey, which is why it feels so isolating at times.
Absolutely. So you have said you want to think about grief differently. What's the traditional
Mhm.
idea of grief, and how are you looking at it differently? How are you working with your clients differently?
So the traditional idea of grief is related to death or like a major loss,
Yeah.
and period.
Yeah.
And anything else is just suck it up, move on, you're a baby, you can get through this kind of thing. And so for me, the new face of grief, and why I wrote the book I did, and why I've really switched to a transformative grief model, is that grief is here as a tool for our growth and is a normal, natural process of life. It
Mhm.
is an experience we will all go through throughout our lives,
Yeah.
which is even more important for us to then teach the next generation how to see it as such, and to feel it in a healthy way and experience it in a healthy way. So the way I've transitioned my work with clients is to no longer um, not encourage, but support them in this feeling of like, woe is me, look what life has done to me, into more of the, where will this take me? What is
Right.
this teaching me? Where will I go from here? Now, I don't do that when someone's in crisis,
Yeah,
because when
sure.
we first have a major loss, whether it be like your friend's experience, the loss of a child, all of a sudden the loss of job and home, the loss of freedoms that we had, and our children are now homeschooling at home. Those of us as parents who had to go through that last year, we will have this moment of shock and awe. And there's no like, what is the greater meaning in this? There's a
Sure.
time for it. So usually the clients I work with have had those catalytic events, whether it be in their childhood, teens, or young adult years, and go, one more thing has sort of like in my experience, an adult had hit and gone, oh, this is something bigger. There's a reason why these things are happening to me.
Yeah.
And I work with them in transforming that into their greater purpose here.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because like you said, you can't really get to those questioning moments of this greater, bigger picture when you're already like you said in crisis, kind of angry or why is this happening? This,
Yeah.
kind of cursing God moments, these
Yeah.
really big, this is awful life-ending stuff. How do you get past that? How do you get past crisis to transformative?
So for some people, it's time. It's having distance from the event that happened or the
Yeah.
experience. And these types of things we're talking about now are actual experience that happened versus a dream that wasn't realized, or a midlife crisis, or whatever it might be. That kind of falls in a different category. um, but these events where there's this, this hit, it's different for each person. For some, they pretty quickly, because they've already been in a healing journey and process in their past, whether it be counseling or
Yeah.
coaching, whatever work that they do, can go, okay, I know I feel this way now. It won't be how I always feel. I've seen myself go through these times, and I know something greater will come. And they tend to come out of things a little bit faster.
Yeah.
They tend to be able to say, I'm allowed to be angry, and I'm allowed to question all of these things. And I'm also allowed to be really grateful for what I have. And I call it the ands of grief. They do add to the experiences with positives and negatives.
Right. So it's just kind of this distance thing
Yeah,
of
yeah. Or whatever work you've already done prior.
right. I
Yeah.
remember I lost my father when I was 11 years old, and I remember I think about this time and I kind of giggle at myself at my naivete, but I remember thinking, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and I'm done. I'm done. Nothing else bad can happen to me because the worst
Mhm.
thing that can happen to me has already happened.
Yeah.
And I mean, I look back on it and now I'm like, wow, that's so not true. That's so not true. We have these, like you said, these grief inducing moments
Yeah.
that we don't even realize are happening to us from that point on.
Right.
And for me personally, mine was cumulative because I had decided that that was the worst thing that was going to happen to me. And I pretty much ignored anything else that came along because it, it was not nearly as bad as that. So I can't complain. But, but yeah, and I paid a hard price for that. And my overall like physical health, emotional health, all of it came crashing down because of it. And I think, you said something really important earlier about get educating people early on to recognize these things and process them along the way so it doesn't feel like this crushing weight when just that one more thing happens, some life event doesn't work out, or job loss, or even kind of this cumulative grievance process we're going through right now. I feel like we're grieving as a planet at the
Yes.
moment, and I feel that. I
Yeah.
feel that. So I know everybody else has to feel that too.
Yeah.
Just processing all of this. Okay, I really wish I had my life back from 2 years ago. But
Right.
but that's not how this is. So how do you transform that to what's happening right now? What happened? How do I move forward?
And I use the example with people of like when you walk into a room where a couple has just argued, you feel the tension of it. You feel like, oh,
Right.
something happened. And sometimes if you're a people pleaser, you're like, what did I do?
Yeah.
Is there something that I've done? So when we walk out into the world, into the grocery store, where we are feeling the grief, the anger, the frustration, the sadness, the fear of everyone. Now, some of us feel it more as the empaths or sponges to these emotions than others, but we're all experiencing it. And you might find yourself a little more reactive after being in situations around others who have heightened emotions of grief. And
Which I'm
so,
not a counselor or an expert, so I'm going to throw that out there before I say this, but yes, I feel like that's where some of this like on edge, on the precipice anger and reactivity is definitely coming from, because there's some heavy energy out there as
yeah,
soon as you walk out the door, or even in our own homes. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like many of us are grieving the losses of friendships or of family relationships through this kind of transformative process that we're all going through semi together.
Right. It would be better if we were able to be more together and collectively feel it.
Sure.
We don't have to be in person doing that,
Sure.
but instead we've really divided ourselves
Yeah.
and said, like I mentioned, often in grief we feel isolated
Mm-hmm.
because it's subjective, or we've taught ourselves to pull away. Other people aren't safe when I have these emotions, or I'm afraid to show these emotions. Well, this is like the best time to work on the healing work because we all are going through it. And we all can say,
Correct.
I'm grieving, you're grieving. Here's how you grieve. Here's how I grieve. I respect and love you. I respect and love you. And move forward in that and talk about those things that make us grieve.
Yeah.
I think it's still a taboo subject.
I think you're right. Yeah. Nobody, and I've said this before on this show, nobody really likes to shine a light on their dark places.
Right. Right.
And it's not comfortable and it's not easy to go to kind of go backwards and recognize, okay, these are all the things that hurt me. These are all the things that I've ignored for all these years. And this is how it has affected my choices moving forward. And kind of this vicious cycle. I mean, what are
Right.
some of somebody who's been living with these hidden grief events? How
Mhm.
can it affect what are some of the effects that you see like in their day-to-day life?
So I find people tend to be a little more reactive to
Mhm.
other people. Triggers, there'll be certain things that are said or done that trigger them a lot faster into a feeling. And anger is typically the most socially appropriate reaction, or for some of us, immediately going to tears and crying.
That's
So
me.
yeah, a level of sensitivity that we feel where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that hit and hurt really hard.
Yeah.
Whereas if we had healed some of those things, we might go, oh, that feels uncomfortable, but it wouldn't maybe cause the reactivity. It affects our performance and work
Mhm.
because we're not as present, we're not as focused, we're not connecting anymore with other people.
Right.
We're just, fill up our time, get really busy so we don't feel things.
Right.
It's affecting our relationships. I mean, we're all numbing ourselves out on our phones or on our computers because we don't want to really talk about what's going on. We don't want to feel that. Um, I address in the book the addiction to escaping. It almost
Right.
becomes like way easier and way more fun, endorphin inducing to escape what it is we need to feel. And so we binge watch shows and we, convince ourselves that this glass of wine is something we deserve because we've had a tough day,
Yeah.
instead of going, I just don't want to feel what it is I'm feeling.
So you're kind of walking this fine line of creating habits that aren't necessarily healthy in the moment. How do you recognize that you're creating these things? Because there are times that can you be in your grief too long, and that there are times that it's appropriate to just unplug and be like, okay, just I can't be in it anymore right now. And
Right.
then there's also the balance of, okay, I'm ignoring it too much.
Right. Yeah. It is completely about balance.
Mm-hmm.
So what I talk to clients about is how they can daily, if not weekly, incorporate grief work into their experience.
Sure.
And that is as simple as doing some journaling as a check-in. How am I doing? What's going on? Guided meditations are an excellent way of just, if you can't, I'm not a big meditation to nothing person. Like I can't just like, let's just quiet the brain. My brain is constantly going. So a guided meditation keeps me a little more focused.
It's the only way I can do it either.
Yeah, because it's
Yeah,
just like
it's
this
really
silence.
helpful. It's very helpful. And I can attest to this personally, and with some of my clients, that's kind of where I've guided them to go. I'm not one of those people that could just like off. Yeah, no.
Right, right. And I really believe that true meditation isn't about, I think so many people teach it's about turning off, but it's actually just observing what goes on
Right.
when you're not attached to it. And I have them do a lot of grounding exercises, get back into your body, not just in your mind constantly, kind of spinning out. So yes, there are times where you can stay in your grief too long. So instead of numbing out with things that actually end up hurting you in the long run, doing things like maybe it is watching something that makes you laugh, or reading a book that gives you hope and support. It's shifting those habits into things that add value versus take away. I've recently watched a documentary that ended up adding more to my grief. Like I was like, oh God, the whole world, it's all coming down. And I was
That's
like, this is not
interesting.
helping.
Yeah.
Versus a documentary about something that, and it is perspective. It's all a matter of perspective, but or reading things that give me hope in the world versus constantly reading things that tell me everything is wrong in the world. So that's a piece you have to be aware of.
Kind of knowing your own triggers is important.
Yes. Yeah.
And asking yourself, okay, is this serving, me healing, or is this adding to my grief? Accumulating.
Right.
A kind of more accumulation of this big feeling that I have, that I can no longer function normally anymore.
Right. And I'll ask clients, do you have time for yourself? Do you have time for self-care? And I explain that self-care isn't always like this, for us, kid-free moment and go to the spa, but it might be, instead of staying up and watching something, going to bed earlier.
Yeah.
It may be, instead of, as much as I love to be proactively packing everything the night before, go and take a bath for yourself and put on some music that you want. It can be different than what we perceive. And most people will say, well, no, I don't have time for those things. But when they look at their day, they see how much time is being spent on the things to, again, numb the feelings they don't want to feel.
Sure.
But often when we have those moments in the bath, or when we have that time to go for a walk, we have to think about the things that we don't want to. And that's the importance of having support, whether it be from a coach, a counselor, a grief guide, to go, I need someone safe to say those things that other people might judge me for. I'm afraid they'll judge me for. We are trained it's not about us. It's not about us and our judgments. It's about giving and holding that space and safety for that person.
What is it, do you think, or what is it that you've learned that keeps us from wanting to, or proactively trying to process and work through these feelings? Because I think back to my own experiences, and I lied to myself a lot, like daily. You're fine. You're tough. Like, you cannot let this get the best of you. It was more of like this burying thing. I just buried it like a pro. And I did. I functioned great until I didn't.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? What is it about us that does not want to do the work?
Okay. So as moms, who do we say, it's okay, everything's fine. No, everything's good. I've got it. I'll take care of it for you.
Yeah.
Who do we say this to?
Our kids.
Our children. Yeah. So it starts from conditioning early on, where our parents, and we as well, feel like we're doing things to help our kids. by removing the experience of pain for them or discomfort, or distracting them with food or something to watch when they're uncomfortable or have hurt themselves. But it conditions them over time to think, I'm not capable, I don't want to, and I've had that bad day, so I deserve.
And I don't have to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's a conditioning that we always think, well, then somebody is to blame, but no one is to blame because it's generational.
Right.
It's
Sure.
all because we were trying to protect, and we want to protect our kids from struggling, but by doing so, we actually create the struggle.
Kind of give them a handicap a little bit.
Yeah.
From the very beginning of not just being able to feel comfortable or safe expressing whatever emotion that is, whatever grievances, because, and I think about some of the grievances that my children have, and it's so easy to be like, oh, that's no big deal,
Right.
later you'll be all grown up and all this stuff will just be so trivial, but it's not. Like right now, these are the biggest things in their lives, these hard, scary, sad things, friendships, or even like the things that are going on with COVID and school and these big scary things. These are very big to them right now. And I'm glad that you pointed that out. I'm glad you pointed that out because they may be going through more of a trauma than we are, because
Right.
these things are in their face daily. I work from home. I can go through my day without having a mask on, or doing all these big scary things, or having to go in public with where there's big signs and it's everywhere. It's in their face every single day, and it's this big scary thing, and then you've got interpersonal relationships on top of it. And yeah, that's a really important point. I hadn't thought to go that direction here, but it does start so early.
It does.
Yeah.
And a kid trips and falls and scrapes their knee, and the go-to is, let me distract you from the pain.
Mhm.
Let me, I don't want you to think about it anymore. Or you're fine, move on, go play, keep going, instead of let me just sit with you. This
Right.
hurts. Let me teach you some things that help better. Like we can clean it, let's put a cool pack on it, but you can continue to cry. It's okay.
Yeah. Right.
And I see that in grandparents and great grandparents that are like, let me bring out all the food things, and it's like, why? No.
Let them have the
Cookies will not make
feeling.
the blood stop. Like there's a scraped knee. So
Right.
there is that feeling of I want to do something when someone is suffering, but the best thing you can do is to sit with them in it and to teach them how to get through it,
Mhm.
and not shove it under, like, push it down, push it down, push it down.
Yeah, absolutely. What if somebody's going through a grieving experience together? So I think about, like I said, I have more friends than I care to even explain that have lost children. And it's hard to know, like, on the outside, how to be supportive, but how does somebody go through that together? Say a couple has this big experience together, and they handle it very differently. How does
Mhm.
that complicate things?
It can make it really challenging because we're used to our partner usually being our rock and someone we can
Yes.
go to because we usually go through things ourselves. But when we both experience that loss, you have to remember that that person is, I'm going to use the word weakness, is in a compromised state.
Mhm.
And so are you.
Right.
So they're not going to be at their best. They're going to be reactive. They're not going to know how to sit with you and your things. And if you keep unloading on them and they keep unloading on you,
Yeah.
it creates this bitterness and frustration. And you weren't there for me.
Yeah.
Well, how can they be there for you when they're in their own grief?
Mhm.
And so it is important to seek safe family support, safe friend support. And I say that really specifically because often we just go to the person who's available and they're not always the safest.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's seeking support and guidance from the people that we trust, that we feel comfortable. And again, an anonymous person can be wonderful.
Yeah.
And this is why there are some great things about the support groups online, because you don't ever have to see those people and you just, this is how I
Right.
feel.
It's kind of a safe space of, I know you're not judging me because you don't know me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you maybe have gone through something similar, so I can say these things.
Right.
But it's honoring and respecting your journey and their journey. And often when we are in grief, we can only see our own situation and we
Right.
forget the other person. And if the other person isn't grieving like us, which is probably what's happening, we struggle. And we have to remember they have their own conditioning around how they're allowed to show sadness. My husband got to pre-read my book, and I was like, here, I'm just gonna let you, you read it and we'll see. And he's German, so he grew up in a different culture, different family dynamic, all the things. And at the end of it, he was like, oh my gosh, I'm grieving. And he like, blah, 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 he listed all these things, and it was like, yes, of course.
I've known this all along.
Right. Like, I just was waiting for you to be, but it reminded me, whoa, lately I've been depending on you to like have it all together in these certain areas.
Yeah.
That's unfair, because you are grieving these things and I'm grieving these things. And I did say, well, who is your person to talk to? Because it can't be me, as I'm going through this stuff right now. And so it was really powerful for us to have that discussion. So if you're listening to this and you are in that state of, we're going through something and we're struggling with each other, sit down and go, it's okay that we can't be each other's person. We can still share about our pain and sadness, but we can't unload all of it.
And I think that's really interesting. And I think it'll be counterintuitive for anybody who is in this situation that's listening, because you're right. You have this partnership, marriage, relationship, partnership, whatever it is, and you've had the shared experience, and this person has been your person for this entire time. But to say, yeah, you can't be my person right now, not for this, may feel like, okay, that's a little, is that right? Should we, is that okay?
It triggers abandonment, it triggers rejection, it triggers like, are we punishing them by, but no, it's actually quite healthy. It's a good boundary. My husband's way of responding to the first miscarriage was the science of it. Well, here's the statistics, and it's a good thing because your body was just saying that this was not right, and I was like, I'm feeling it. I'm the one who had to go into the emergency room. I can't go into the science. And there was a moment where I wanted to fight with him, but I think we both figured out very quickly, we just probably shouldn't talk about it on that level with each other. Right. And instead hold each other and cry. And that's, or share what it feels like now that we go, okay, well, now we don't need to set up the baby room. And like, what are we going to do with that space now? That discussion, like those things we can do together, but explaining it, or when you have the trauma done to your body, you relive it, you experience it. And that work I couldn't keep bringing to him, because it wasn't his experience, and he was already having his own, like, how do I process this? How do I make sense of this? I was already looking at the budget. How are we going to afford the next child? He had his own things he has to let go of.
And that's important too, because and as men and women in general, we kind of operate on different frequencies on a lot of things, and especially kind of these bigger things. I was listening to your experience. I was like, I I understand that completely. I know where you're coming from. And kind of this, you do kind of live with it past, because it was something that happened to your body, and your body is still healing, far past how they've processed it in their minds, and to be able to kind of understand each other in that way, talking about miscarriage specifically, or pregnancy loss specifically, um, you're on different paths with the same trauma.
Right. Yeah. And so when we say the same trauma, we think, well, then we'll be similar. but we won't. And that's okay. That's
Yeah.
okay.
It's kind of the same event, but you experience it differently. And I
Yeah.
think that's, what what if how would you guide somebody who again has a shared trauma but decides that I am not going to recognize what I'm going through right now. My sole job is going to be here for you, my partner.
So the denial of their own experience.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
How does that affect somebody moving forward in being able to process um, any trauma that comes along after?
Yeah. So many of the clients I work with were children of parents who struggled to handle their own emotions and such. And
Mhm.
so they had to learn how to hold it in and take care of things.
Yeah.
So, that can happen as well. It's not always just that we need to take care of our partner, but the child can then feel like they need to take care of
The
their
parent.
parents. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when that dynamic happens, I find that I see those clients in adulthood coming and going, wow, this small thing, they call it small, but this small thing that created grief, and maybe it's a little g grief,
Mhm.
has now triggered the big G grief from earlier. And
Yeah.
now I'm ready to face it. Or I need to face it because now it's all spilling out everywhere. Um, so that I see happening. But if you find yourself, no, I got to hold it together for everyone else. My question would be, what about the grief process makes you feel like you wouldn't still be holding some things together?
Mhm.
Because I think we think black or white with grief, like it's all out there or
Yeah.
it's we hold it all in versus I can, there's the beauty of the therapy office is you've got 45 minutes to an hour of that space just being,
Yeah.
as soon as you walk out the door, you get to go, okay, it's done. Now, therapy for me last year was online for my clients. So it wasn't like, now the computer is off. And now, so we had to talk about that ritual of how do I end the discussion
Yeah.
here and move forward into the next room. It's the same as when you work from home. Like, how do I let go of work and move
Right.
into the next? And that's some boundaries you have to teach a client. But grief work isn't 24/7.
Mhm.
It's creating the safe space for it and then learning how to bring it back and continue about our day. And that again goes back to some of that conditioning of we felt like, if I do experience and feel it all, it will take eons.
Sure. So
I
is it
have,
almost like compartmentalizing or making a choice that this is the time that I am giving to working on this hidden grief that I've held on to for so long? This is the time that I'm giving. Do you find that when you work with a client and you work like that, that it will slowly create more and more and more and more space for them to breathe and feel whole again?
yeah. So if you think about an injury, we don't immediately like all the physical therapy all the time, everything, every 24/7. No, we do our physical therapy however many times a week. We do our stretches before bed or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And then we slowly get back into it. And I'm a runner. So then slowly, if it's running, injury for that, you start to run again. But it's not all the time, everything. So it is about a healing component like that, where it's okay, we create that space for it. And then we go about doing our other things. And maybe we still feel triggered and emotional, but we know that that's okay,
Right.
that we can stop and cry if we need to, or hey, I'm feeling more reactive and angry, I should probably ask for help. Somebody can you pick up dinner tonight? I'm not in a space to cook, I need a break from the kids, or I need this or that. We start to learn how to voice what we need versus react out of I can't anymore.
Yeah.
And those tools are what help it slowly over time. You start to feel like you can breathe and you realize, wow, I've really been working on this. The other day, my husband was like, out of all the people I know, you've done the most grief work, and yet you still feel this way about. And I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
because it doesn't really go away. It
Yeah.
integrates with your system. And then when you feel it, you know it, and then you know what you need to do to work on it.
Right.
It'd be, hey, honey, I just need to go journal this out. I need to go talk to that particular friend or whatever. And so it's been a lesson for him too, that this isn't like, one and done.
It
One
doesn't
year time is
resolve,
good.
basically,
Yeah,
is what you're saying. It's a process of learning how to live with it in a healthy manner so
right.
that you're functioning, at a higher level within your day-to-day world and within your family structure or friend structure,
Yeah,
but feeling safe to be able to still work on it.
right. Right.
And that was something I was thinking about while you were speaking, is the importance of feeling safe and being able to express, this is what I need, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I can't do right now, whatever that may be. So
Yeah.
how much of this is a process with, like, an interpersonal process with the people that are in your world too? How do you say you're going through your grief process, but how do you express that to the people within your sphere?
Yes. That's important. I think communication when we're grieving is essential. And yet we're not taught how to do that either.
Right.
It is very important because often you need to put up a boundary to
Mhm.
certain people in your life.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like family loss, and maybe you don't want to attend that holiday event with all the people and act like everything's okay.
Mhm.
And so you need some space. And by saying no, you now disrupt the whole family, and everybody's calling you going, well, why not? Oh, but it would make mom so happy, whatever. It truly is about saying, this is what I need. I understand your needs, but I really have to put myself first right now.
Mhm.
Hopefully next year I'll be there, or
Yeah.
whatever, what that looks like. Or, I am grieving the loss of this child. And as much as I love that you want to be there for me, I already have some good, healthy support people in place. I'll reach out to you when I'm ready.
Yeah.
And nowadays with technology, some people will send you all these text messages or memes or this and that, and like, oh, and the birth of a child is this and the loss of a child is this or whatever, and you're like, no.
Yeah.
And you can say, I'm sorry, but this is actually making me feel worse than how it's
Yeah.
okay that makes them uncomfortable. We're always protecting everyone else, but we really have to say, this doesn't work for me.
That's really funny. I 100% agree with that sentiment. That was something I think I've struggled with my whole life, is just being very frank with people until recently. Like, it's probably been within the last few years, and I don't know what happened. Maybe it was my own process of going through grief, but I reached a point where it's easy now to say, yeah, that doesn't work for me. I don't like that. Or,
Yeah.
not in a rude way, but I don't think it's that I've ever felt more free in just being honest with somebody about the interaction that we were having, and it's not blown up in my face yet. So,
Good.
and I try
Yeah.
to get, my clients to practice that very just basic honor. And it doesn't even have to be in a negative way. I think we have a hard time even saying, this right here, this makes me happy. This moment
Yes.
right here.
Yeah.
It's not even, you know, conversely, this makes me unhappy. Like, I don't like this, which is
Right.
also just as important, but we have such a hard time saying yes and no, or this is how I feel, or when really it's probably the simplest thing you can do in setting a boundary with somebody, or setting an expectation of how you want to be treated in that moment.
Right.
And
Right.
especially if you're going through kind of a grief process.
Right. And it might be the most, uh, abstract or odd thing in that moment to say, please stop sending me quotes about grief and loss.
Yeah.
Send me stuff that makes me laugh. And
Yeah.
somebody would be like, what? I'd be like, that's what I need. I need laughter. I need to feel that
Yeah.
like cool water on my soul of all the sadness.
Yeah.
Send me funny stuff. And they might think that's the weirdest thing, but you're telling them what you need.
You're right.
And often when we tell someone no, we don't give them the tool of what they can do. And so it
Right.
leaves them in a panic and they're like, I've done something wrong. And instead you say, it can be again, I love that you call and check in on me, but you keep asking me the same questions.
Yeah.
How about we talk about something else in the future? These are the things I'm comfortable talking about. And
Yeah.
it gives them like, oh, okay, now I know how I can help.
What about laughter? And I think if I read correctly, in your book, you talk about laughter as being part of healing through your grief. Kind of what's the old grief and what's the new rules of grief?
Yeah. Oh, so that's two questions in one. Okay,
Okay.
so let's start with the rules, because that's, I believe, chapter 3 in the book is actually about the rules of grief
Okay.
and how we
Okay.
need to let them go.
Okay.
The old rules are the black and white. You're not crying enough. You're crying too much.
Mm,
You haven't gotten out of bed yet. You need to stay home more. You're not wearing dark enough colors, or it's the I will never be enough type
yeah.
rules.
Yeah.
And the new rules, I believe, are we should not do things that can permanently harm ourselves or harm others. And we should not walk away from our lives
Mhm.
in whatever form or fashion that is. And that attributes to suicide as well as midlife crisis sort of events that we stereotypically think of, where it's like, I'm
Yeah.
gone. This isn't what I wanted. I didn't
I
sign up
can't
for this.
do
I'm
this
out.
anymore. I'm starting
Exactly.
over. I'm out.
Yeah. So those are my two big ones. It's the same. I work with kids. When we're angry, we don't harm others or ourselves or break anything.
Yeah.
So that's the same with grief. Like, don't harm yourself, don't harm others. And we're going to say things that hurt, but don't, that permanent damage is
Can
the
you
piece.
break things though if you're an adult?
Oh my gosh, yeah. You totally can.
I'm totally kidding.
You totally can. But not the things that later on you're like, oh man, I really needed that
Right.
thing. So you find that safe thing that you can. I'm a big proponent of like hammer and nail and a piece of wood and just
Go to town.
for
Sure.
fun, just to be like, I got to get this out. So there are safe ways to let out that frustration for
There's
sure.
this new concept in the town that I live in, and it's probably I don't know if you might find it in Germany, you might not, but it's like this destruction room.
Oh
They
yeah.
have yeah, and I thought that was probably the most brilliant thing, and it opened up like during COVID. So the whole everybody's just all wound up and frustrated and angry, and I think it was probably the busiest that they had ever been. But I like that concept of just being able to like a good scream, a good cry, a good
Yeah.
throw something, break something,
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever,
They're
as
called,
long as it's meant to be broken.
right. Exactly. They're called rage rooms. And I just
Yes,
think
that was
it's a
it. Yeah.
brilliant idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's a brilliant idea because we have so much pent up because we
Yeah.
haven't learned how to develop.
Yeah.
So humor, I think, is a tool that it's a personality difference thing. Some are going to be really comfortable and some are going to think that it's like the worst thing you can do in your grief. And some of that might be conditioning, and some of it again is just personality, which many of us are born with particular characteristics. So you do what's comfortable for you, but I want to give more people permission to have humor in their grief.
Yeah.
And that can be, for some, it's dark humor, and more satirical. And then on the other side, it's the using humor to feel this like lift of like, I can laugh at this. Like when my mom died, we were able to laugh at some of the things that she would have not liked or liked, or, and those pieces, you just have to go, ah, because humor is sort of that opposite of the suffering and struggle. If
Yeah.
we're able to laugh, there's hope. If we're able to laugh, there is going to be this, light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm a huge proponent of watching things that make you laugh, reading things that make you laugh. Right after my third was born, I went through a period of postpartum depression like I did the first two. And I reached out to a very special friend and was just like, I'm in it. I am in the thick. And we had already talked about like when we get there, like when I get here, and she immediately started sending me hilarious Instagram reels. And it was like every night at like the 2 a.m. feeding, I had like 10 to watch. And it
Yeah.
just was like, thank you.
It was just a
Thank
relief.
you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so there is a place for humor in grief when we are comfortable. And if you're uncomfortable, I'd say explore why.
Yeah.
Does it feel like you're not honoring the person? Does it feel like you're not saying this is really bad? And then what is that about? So you just have to keep taking it further and further, because there aren't too many ways where humor can help in grief. It may not be the best time at certain times, but eventually there's a space where you can laugh again.
Yeah. And I think that, that was a really important thing you said, is that it also gives you this, even if you catch yourself in the moment, like, wow, maybe I really shouldn't be laughing right now. It gave you a glimpse of get what it's going to be like to get to the other side. Not that
Right,
the grief is gone, but that
right,
you're through like the darkest part, and
right.
that you can get there. And then that next, you know, stretch of time may look different.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too. Someone asked me one time how I what my grief process was with losing my father. I was 11 years old, and I thought about it a lot
Mhm,
before I answered this question, or before I came to a conclusion, is that I grieved him repetitively and
mhm,
at different times in my life and at different stages and in different ways. And they were all very different. I
yeah,
grieved him one way as a child. I grieved him another way in high school. I grieved him another way on my wedding day. I
yeah,
grieved him another way becoming a mother. I grieve him differently now. My kids are a little older. It's all been very different, but it's all been very manageable.
yeah,
Um, but I don't think I recognized it until I really sat down and thought, okay, I've gone through this process repetitively, but differently.
yes,
And it wasn't easier, it wasn't harder, it was just different.
yes,
Yeah.
completely. Because as you grow, you have other smaller grief incidences that
Yes.
then shape how you are grieving that longer term thing
Yes.
as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And all of it is right.
Yeah.
All of it is right. And that often we think, like, oh, well, this is wrong. I shouldn't feel this way. Or, hey, it's been forever. Like, why do I still feel this?
Yeah.
Because there's an absence there. There was a should. He
Yeah.
should have been here, or my kids should have. And I have that with my third is the first to not meet my mother.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, this was not supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be this way. She should
Right.
have. And when I catch myself feeling that panic, I don't then, well, stop thinking like that. And
Yeah.
I'm
Kind of
like, okay,
punish yourself.
right. Like I understand why I'm feeling this way. I understand what this is about. I'm allowed to feel this,
Yeah.
but I don't have to put so much weight to the feeling that this is how it is.
Right.
I just understand this is my brain's processing of this loss that was only about 3 years ago now.
Yeah. And how important is it to understand that your grief process is kind of experimental? It's up to you, like experimenting with what works and what doesn't work. Because does talk therapy work for everybody?
I don't believe it works for everybody.
Yeah.
And that was a big reason why when I started to transition into this transformative grief guide, I
Mhm.
do a lot more of like the energy work of it, the guided meditations, the getting out of our head and not always using our words for things, but allowing the words to come after we feel it, we sit with
Yeah.
it in our bodies. Using art or movement to create expression of
Yeah.
what's going on. So, and I think many therapists have figured this out as well. There are some of us who, and I used to be this way too, it's just way easier to stay in our heads because
Yeah.
we can logically explain so much and then we don't have to feel it. And we sort of cut our heads off from the rest of our bodies and we're like, nope, not going to feel it, not going to experience this. And so therapy just becomes this sort of repetitive place to keep playing out the words versus I'm really going to feel it. And if you have a good therapist, they're going to make you stop talking and
Sure.
just
And be
sit.
with it.
Yeah. And just sit with a statement and maybe repeat that statement to you and go, I don't want to hear your response, but feel that. So,
Right. And I can attest to that. I discovered completely by accident that yoga nidra for me was better than talk therapy.
yeah.
I've tried talk therapy in the past, um, for my pregnancy loss and my dad and all of that. And it was the same thing. Like for me, it was on a loop and it wasn't taking me anywhere. And I was still feeling these very heavy things. And I went to a yoga nidra guided meditation with a dear friend of mine who has actually been on my podcast here. And I didn't realize that I had been particularly overwhelmed or just completely stuck in my body and my head. And I came out of that meditation and I didn't realize I was bawling my eyes out. I, I,
Wow.
it was like, I went into the meditation and I woke up and I just these tears. I wasn't crying, blubbering, anything like that. They were
Yeah.
just like coming out of my eyes. I was like, wow, okay. I must have been feeling something or
Yeah.
holding on to something that I didn't realize. And she told me to stop. Don't say anything. Just be with whatever you're feeling right now. And
Yeah.
it was probably the biggest release that I've had in terms of emotion, and I wasn't even trying.
Right.
And
Right. Because
yeah,
that's truly how grief works. When we
yeah,
stop trying, it flows.
yeah,
As soon as we can try to control it, it gets stuck.
yeah, yeah. So important. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation. I know it's kind of, a heavy topic, but I think it's extremely important. And like I said before, I think it's extremely important for where we are right now as a society and even worldwide, to really spend this time to work through any kind of grief that we may have in our past or even currently. So I really appreciate it. So where can we find your book? Again, it's for pre-order, right now.
Yeah, right now it's pre-order. The website for the book is thenewfaceofgrief.com.
Okay.
And there you can find where the pre-order is on Amazon, and soon it'll be on Barnes and Noble and other major stores. And if you want to connect with me, you
Yes.
can find me on Instagram at katie.rössler, or my website is katierössler.com.
Okay, awesome. And all of that will be in the show notes for anybody who wants to maybe reach out, get in touch, or check out the book. So, Katie, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to reading it myself.
Thank you so much, Brandy. I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this conversation.
All right.